Today we're exploring what it means to imagine a world built upon love and community in place of hierarchy and power, as well as how our current system as it stands today runs off the back of religious exploitation. When we think about the English Revolution, the story is often told through the rise of the Puritans and their attempts to remake English society. But they weren't the only people imagining a new world. In the turbulent decades of the 1640s and 50s, another movement emerged from below. It was made up of itinerant workers, dispossessed laborers, religious radicals, and young intellectual rebels who rejected both Anglican authority and Puritan orthodoxy. Together, they envisioned a different kind of revolution, one rooted in older traditions of shared land and common rights, yet pointing toward a remarkably egalitarian future. Amid civil war, political upheaval, and religious ferment, these men and women formed a radical underground. They believed that divine authority did not belong to kings, bishops, or elites, but could emerge from ordinary people. As the radical thinker Gerard Winstanley put it, Christ would rise up in sons and daughters to build a new society founded not on hierarchy and power, but on equality, community, and love. Winstanley, the spokesperson of the True Levelers, or also known as the Diggers, together with several others in 1649, occupied a piece of common land in St. George's Hill, just outside of London, where they tore down fences to plant vegetables and invited all to come in and help them. They declared that England would never be free until all enjoyed a free allowance to dig and labor in the commons. This idea of communionism is a socioeconomic order centered on common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange that allocates products in society based on need, was short-lived as they were harassed in court by wealthy private landowners. This capitalistic abolition of communally owned land through legal mechanisms is a practice that is still happening today. This may be done in several ways, but commonly through something called eminent domain, which allows governments and capitalist societies to condemn and seize private property for public purposes, like infrastructure or urban renewal, which in turn gets passed on to private development companies, provided that the original landowners receive just compensation. However, just gets defined. This power can indirectly affect communal land ownership by enabling projects that reshape land use and ownership patterns in affected areas. Historical examples of court cases include Penn Central Transportation v. New York City, Cole v. United States, and Lucas v. South Carolina Coastal Council. These cases dealt with issues of eminent domain and the government's right to take private property for public use. The most well-known and controversial case, though, was that of Kellow v. City of New London. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that private economic development qualifies as public use under the Fifth Amendment. This decision allowed the city to condemn residential properties for a failed development project. Cases like Kellow, as well as many others, have sparked significant public disapproval, leading to reforms in many states aimed at protecting property rights. But despite reforms, this is still an issue that many states still allow. Other legal mechanisms used may include government-enforced enclosure acts and privatization policies that convert collectively held land into privately owned property. These examples illustrate how capitalism, through legal frameworks, can undermine communal land ownership, often prioritizing private development over community needs. And typically, this displacement negatively impacts low-income communities the most. Around the time the common land was established on St. George's Hill between 1648 and 52, Winstanley had assembled a compelling theology of communism by publishing pamphlets and treatises that fused theology, metaphysics, history, and politics. He proclaimed in the True Levelers Standard Advanced that the great creator reason made the earth to be a common treasury. He believed that a great mystery had been unfolding on St. George's Hill and that a spiritual revolution was seen by the material eyes of the flesh. And the scripture that says the poor shall inherit the earth is really and materially to be fulfilled. You see, much like other revolutionaries, he hadn't always been this way. And his example shows us that we can all decide to be better, no matter where we are in life. He had been a successful cloth merchant in London, feeding the capitalist engine until his business failed in 1643 and was forced to move to Cobham, where he labored as a cowherd. He was writing a lot at this time, and based on his writings, Winstanley showed self-reflection and criticism, not only on himself, but on the dubious ethics of commerce, recalling unscrupulous traders who demanded sometimes too much for their goods. After falling into rural wage labor, he experienced the hardships and indignities of poverty, sickness, frowns of friends, hated of men, losses of his estate by fire, and being cheated by false-spirited men. Although he had been devoutly religious, he found that no Christian church denomination offered the poor anything beyond chastisement or the afterlife. It was from these experiences of personal ruin and despair that shaped his theology, which at that time was viewed as radical. And let's be honest, it still is viewed as radical today. And what happens to radical ideas that challenge a system of empire, one that operates through exploitation and oppression? Empire co-opts a message of hope, twists and contorts it over time, and then slow boils the masses into believing that divine guidance aligns with them, and is always aligned with administrative ordinance. Think of the recent push of propaganda to rewrite history and convince the American people that America was founded as a Christian nation. To understand how corporate America became so invested in promoting a particular version of Christianity, we need to go back to the early 1640s. The story is recounted by historian Kevin Kruse in One Nation Under God. It begins at the 1940 convention of the National Association of Manufacturers, held at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The timing matters. America was still recovering from the Great Depression. More than a decade had passed since the stock market crash, but the economic and political consequences were still unfolding. Large corporations and financial institutions had suffered a catastrophic loss of public trust. Many Americans blamed business leaders for the economic collapse, and that perception created a political opening for Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Throughout the 1930s, Roosevelt's administration expanded the role of government in economic life through banking reforms, labor protections, public works programs, and social welfare initiatives. These measures were popular with much of the public, but many business leaders viewed them as a direct threat to free enterprise. Corporate organizations fought back. The National Association of Manufacturers spent enormous sums on public relations campaigns intended to restore confidence in business and promote the virtues of the free market. They sponsored radio broadcasts, distributed educational materials, cultivated favorable press coverage, and funded speakers across the country. The results were disappointing. For many Americans, abstract arguments about the benefits of unfettered capitalism carried little weight. After a decade of economic hardship, business organizations found themselves struggling to persuade a public that remained skeptical of their motives. Some corporate leaders concluded that a different strategy was needed, though. In 1939, National Association of Manufacturers President H.W. Prentice suggested that the defense of free enterprise could not be won through economic arguments alone. What America needed, he argued, was a revival of both patriotism and religious faith. That idea set the stage for the appearance of Reverend James W. Fifield at the association's 1940 convention. Fifield was a Congregationalist minister from Los Angeles who had developed a religious critique of the New Deal. In his view, Christianity emphasized individual responsibility, personal liberty, and private property. Government programs that expanded state authority were not merely inefficient, they were inconsistent with the moral principles he believed Christianity taught. For the executives gathered in New York, Fifield offered something they had struggled to provide themselves: a moral and spiritual justification for free market capitalism. This was a significant shift in strategy. Rather as defending capitalism solely as the most efficient economic system, advocates could now present it as a system most consistent with Christian values. Opposition to government intervention could be framed not only as economic preference, but as a matter of religious conviction. Following the convention, Fifield became one of the leading figures in a broader effort to connect Christianity, individualism, and free enterprise. Working from his church in Los Angeles, he founded an organization known as Spiritual Mobilization. Its purpose was to encourage ministers across the country to promote a vision of Christianity that emphasized limited government, private property rights, and individual freedom. The movement attracted substantial financial backing from prominent business leaders and major corporations. By the late 1940s, spiritual mobilization claimed support from more than 12,000 ministers nationwide. Corporate donors included executives from the automobile, steel, oil, and manufacturing sectors, who viewed the organization as an effective vehicle for advancing their political and economic goals. One of spiritual mobilization's most important tools was a magazine called Faith and Freedom. Through articles, editorials, and voter guidance materials, the publication encouraged readers to view free enterprise as a religious principle and to approach politics through that lens. The significance of this campaign extended far beyond the immediate political battles of the New Deal era. As historian Kevin Kruse argues, these efforts helped forge a lasting connection between conservative Christianity and free market ideology. This alliance was not simply the product of long-standing religious tradition. It was actively cultivated through decades of organizing, fundraising, and publishing and political advocacy. That work would prove especially consequential as the United States entered a new era of global conflict. By the late 1940s, anti-communism had become a powerful organizing force in American public life, and religious leaders increasingly framed the struggle against communism as both a political and a spiritual battle. Before the Cold War, Billy Graham was just one of the thousands of struggling revival preachers traveling the so-called Sawdust Trail. Then history handed him an opportunity. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear weapon. China fell to Mao's communist revolution, and Americans suddenly found themselves living with the fear of communism abroad and nuclear war at home. In that climate of anxiety, Graham's message found a national audience. He presented Christianity not only as a path to personal salvation, but also as a bulwark against the atheistic threat of communism, a theme that resonated deeply with a public already primed by years of efforts to link faith, freedom, and the defense of free enterprise. Graham's message arrived at exactly the right moment. He wasn't known for complex theology or intellectual debates. Instead, he preached patriotic optimism, personal salvation, and a simple moral framework: Christian America versus atheistic communism. His big break came during a revival in Los Angeles that was supposed to last 3 weeks, but stretched to 8. Newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst was so impressed that he reportedly told his editors to puff Graham. Almost overnight, Graham became a national celebrity. As his influence grew, Graham forged a close relationship with President Dwight Eisenhower. Together, they helped promote the idea of America as a uniquely Christian nation. During this period, "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. "In God We Trust" became the national motto on U.S. currency, and the National Prayer Breakfast emerged as a major fixture of Washington political life. But this transformation wasn't only religious, it was very political. In the 19th century, many evangelicals had been associated with reform movements like abolition and women's suffrage. By the mid-20th century, however, prominent evangelical leaders were increasingly aligned with wealthy conservative industrialists who opposed New Deal liberalism and the expansion of federal government programs. Figures like oil executive J. Howard Pugh worked alongside Graham and other evangelical leaders to build institutions that connected Christianity with free market capitalism and anti-communism. Organizations such as the National Association of Evangelicals became influential voices against progressive social policies, helping to reshape the political identity of American evangelicalism. Graham's preaching reinforced the idea that prosperity reflected virtue, a modern version of the Protestant work ethic. At a time when Americans were confronting rapid social and cultural change, from fears of nuclear war to debates over rock music, sexuality, and shifting social norms, his message offered certainty. Right and wrong seemed clear. Christianity was presented as the answer to both personal anxiety and national decline. In 1952, Graham declared that the great struggle of the age was between communism and Christianity and called for a national revival. His message resonated deeply. Church attendance rose dramatically in the decades after World War II, and religious identity became increasingly intertwined with American patriotism. At the same time, debates over race and government assistance were becoming part of this new political narrative. As the civil rights movement sought equal access to economic and social opportunities, opponents often dismissed it as communist-inspired. Meanwhile, cultural messages increasingly celebrated individual self-reliance while portraying dependence on government programs as a moral failing. Leading up to the 1970s, these ideas had spread far beyond churches and political organizations. They appeared in popular culture, including country music, where hardworking laborers were celebrated and welfare recipients were often depicted as symbols of national decline. The result was a powerful fusion of Christianity, patriotism, anti-communism, and free market ideology, one that would shape modern American conservatism for decades to come. By the time Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, these ideas had become deeply embedded in American political culture. Nixon and Graham shared a close relationship, and both men understood the power of religious language in shaping public opinion. The result was a growing fusion of patriotism, Christianity, and a suspicion of government intervention in both the economy and private life. The real transformation came throughout the 70s and 80s as economic turmoil, inflation, and social change unsettled the country. Business leaders invested heavily in think tanks, lobbying organizations, and media networks designed to defend free market capitalism. At the same time, conservative religious leaders mobilized millions of evangelicals around concerns about family, morality, and national identity. These movements weren't identical, but they increasingly found common cause. Then came Ronald Reagan. Reagan offered something more than policy proposals. He offered a story. America, he argued, had lost its way. Government had grown too large. Traditional values had weakened. Faith and freedom needed to be restored. His administration delivered on many of the economic goals long sought by corporate conservatives. Major tax cuts through the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, sweeping deregulation, and a renewed emphasis on market solutions over government programs. At the same time, Reagan embraced the language and symbolism of evangelical Christianity, forging close ties with the leaders of the religious right and presenting conservative politics as a moral crusade. By the end of the Reagan era, the marriage between evangelical Christianity and free market capitalism felt almost natural to many Americans. But it wasn't inevitable. It had been built carefully, deliberately, over decades through sermons, magazines, political campaigns, corporate organizing, and media empires. What figures like Billy Graham helped accomplish was not simply the defense of capitalism. It was the sanctification of a particular vision of American capitalism. Economic choices became moral choices. Political commitments became expressions of faith. And in the process, the boundaries between religion, economics, and partisan politics grew increasingly difficult to separate. But the story doesn't end with Billy Graham and the Cold War. According to historian Bethany Morton, the alliance between evangelical Christianity and free market capitalism would go on to fundamentally reshape the American economy. Morton argues that corporations learned to present themselves not as faceless monopolies, but as embodiments of family values. Instead of the image of ruthless industrial tycoons, Americans were encouraged to see companies like Walmart and later on companies like Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby as family enterprises run by wholesome, God-fearing people. That image helped build support for a political movement that favored deregulation, lower taxes, and fewer restrictions on corporate growth. During the Reagan era, antitrust enforcement weakened, financial markets were liberalized, and policymakers promised that the benefits of economic growth would eventually trickle down to ordinary workers. But for many Americans, that promise never materialized. The gap between executives and workers exploded in the middle of the 20th century. The average CEO earned about 20 times what a typical worker made. Today, that figure is measured in the hundreds. At the same time, top tax rates fell dramatically. Wages stagnated and productivity continued to rise. For much of the past several decades, American workers have produced more value than ever before without seeing comparable gains in pay. The federal minimum wage, meanwhile, has remained stuck at $7.25 an hour since 2009. The result is a striking contradiction, an era of enormous corporate wealth alongside growing economic insecurity for millions of working Americans. And for critics like Morton, that outcome wasn't an accident. It was the product of a political and cultural project that fused Christian identity with the ideals of free market capitalism. This fusion didn't reshape the workplace. It also changed how many Americans came to understand success, morality, and even their relationship with God. As these ideas spread beyond boardrooms and into churches, the boundary between faith and the free market became increasingly blurred. In our next episode, we'll explore how religious institutions helped reinforce this worldview and how it eventually gave rise to the prosperity gospel, the belief that wealth itself can be a sign of divine favor. So, see you in the next episode.